The idea to explore the forest trail came out of nowhere. We were bored, looking for something to do that didn't involve staying home and watching TV. Bruno, who's always the most excited and adventurous, suggested the hike. He had heard about this somewhat hidden trail, away from the more popular tourist spots. It seemed like a good idea to break the routine, clear our heads, and maybe discover some interesting places to explore. It was a hot Saturday afternoon, the perfect kind of day for an adventure. We left the house around 3 in the afternoon, each with our backpacks, water, and some snacks. The plan was simple: walk, enjoy nature, and get back before dark. Nothing too complicated, right? What could go wrong? As soon as we reached the start of the trail, it felt almost magical to enter the forest. The trees were tall, with green leaves forming a natural canopy above us. The ground was covered with dry leaves that made a crunchy sound with every step. The trail itself was well marked but narrow, with bushes and small flowers on the sides. As we walked, conversation flowed naturally. We talked about school, future plans, and of course, the spooky stories Bruno loved to tell. He always had a new story about some urban legend or supernatural experience. Lucas, on the other hand, never took anything seriously. He was always making jokes, which kept the mood light. And Carla? Well, Carla was the voice of reason, always reminding us to stick together and be careful. As we continued on the trail, the landscape changed a bit. The trees became denser and the air cooler. The sound of birds and the rustling leaves in the wind created a natural, almost hypnotic soundtrack. Occasionally, we stopped to take photos or just enjoy the view. It was amazing how the forest could be both calm and refreshing at the same time. After about an hour of walking, we started to notice that the trail was becoming less clear. The path, which had been well defined, was now covered with vegetation, as if no one had been there for a long time. This only piqued our curiosity. We wanted to see what was beyond this point. It felt like uncharted territory. As we walked, I noticed the sun starting to set, casting long shadows and creating a slightly eerie effect in the forest. Despite this, no one seemed worried. We were all excited about the idea of discovering something new. I felt a mix of excitement and a slight unease. Something about the place was starting to make me feel uneasy, but I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. In this atmosphere of anticipation, Lucas suddenly stopped and pointed at something among the trees. At first, I couldn't see anything, but as I got closer, I realized what he was showing: a wooden cabin partially hidden among the trees. It looked like it had come out of an old movie, with worn wood, peeling paint, and an overall abandoned appearance. A wave of excitement ran through the group. Bruno was the first to suggest we should check out the cabin up close. Carla, always more cautious, was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of her. We decided to approach and see what we would find inside. From that moment on, something changed in the air. The forest, which had been welcoming, seemed to grow colder and quieter. Even without saying a word, we all felt a sort of nervousness in the air. But, as always, adventure and curiosity drove us forward, unsure of what awaited us in that abandoned cabin. As we approached the cabin, the forest around us seemed to grow even quieter. The sound of birds had faded, and even the wind through the trees seemed to have stopped. That old, worn building in the middle of nowhere already had a strange aura, but our curiosity pushed us to keep going. The cabin was small and rudimentary, built with dark wood planks that were worn and covered in moss. Some of the planks were loose or missing, revealing a dark and gloomy interior. The windows, though still standing, were broken, with shards of glass hanging dangerously. On the ground in front of the door, vegetation had grown, as if no one had been there for years. Bruno, as always the boldest, was the first to approach the door. It was slightly ajar, with a creaky sound echoing through the forest as he pushed it open a little more. Carla stayed behind, visibly nervous, while Lucas and I exchanged looks of anxiety and excitement. The feeling that we were doing something forbidden, or at least reckless, was palpable. Should we go in? Should we go in? Bruno asked, trying to hide the excitement in his voice. Lucas laughed nervously and said, "We've come this far, right?" Carla, though hesitant, eventually agreed, and I, fighting against a shiver running down my spine, took a cautious step forward, not knowing what to expect inside. The first thing I noticed when we entered was the smell. A strong odor of mold, damp wood, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Perhaps it was the smell of darkness and abandonment itself. The interior was dark, even with the faint light coming through the broken windows. The floor was covered with dry leaves and dirt, and the sound of our footsteps echoed through the small structure. The main room was small and almost empty, except for an old table and a few fallen chairs. Everything was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The wooden walls had dark stains, as if they had been wet several times, and some parts were faded or worn. In one corner, an old fireplace, filled with ashes and debris, hinted that the cabin had been inhabited at some point. It was one of those nights when you just want to get home. I had left work later than usual, and exhaustion was hitting hard. I decided to take a shortcut on a secondary road I had never used before. That route was known for not being very safe, and strange things happened there. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. Besides, it would save me a lot of time. On the GPS, it looked like a quicker route, but as I went along, things started to seem strange. Could the local legends really be true? The road was narrow, unlit, and the trees closed in around me, forming a dark tunnel. There were no signs of other cars, and the only light came from my headlights, illuminating the path ahead. I started to wonder if I had made the right choice, but I was already halfway through, and turning back seemed more complicated than just continuing forward. After about 30 minutes of driving down that deserted road, I saw something ahead. A car was parked on the shoulder, with its hood up. There was no sign of movement, but the interior light was on. Instinctively, I slowed down, thinking about stopping to help, but something told me to keep going. It was late, and I was alone on an unfamiliar road. As I passed by the car, I glanced quickly inside. I saw a figure sitting in the driver's seat, but the face was covered in shadows. My stomach tightened, and I kept driving, accelerating a bit more. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. A few minutes later, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that the parked car was now behind me. The headlights were shining in the mirror, and it seemed to be closing in rapidly. Fear began to grow. Who was in that car? Why was it following me? I tried to stay calm and kept driving, but the road seemed endless. The turns were sharp, and the trees around made everything feel more claustrophobic. The car behind me kept getting closer until it was so near I could see the headlights glow reflected in my rear window. Then it started flashing its headlights, as if trying to force me to stop. My heart raced. I didn't know what to do. Stopping could be dangerous. If I kept going, it might try something more aggressive. That's when I decided to speed up, hoping to shake it off. The engine roared as I pressed hard on the accelerator. The winding road made it difficult to gain speed, but I was determined to escape. The car behind me also accelerated, staying on my tail. I could feel the panic rising with every turn, every bump I had to avoid. At one point, I managed to gain some distance, but then the car's lights disappeared suddenly. The fear I felt turned into unsettling confusion. Had it left the road? Or had it just turned off its lights? I kept driving, now faster than ever, hoping to see some signs of civilization. But the road seemed to stretch on infinitely. The silence was piercing, and the darkness around felt more oppressive than before. Then, suddenly, the car reappeared in the rearview mirror, its headlights on and flashing frantically. It was closer than before, and the adrenaline made my whole body tremble. But before I could react, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. There was no time to think. I slammed on the brakes with all my might, causing the car to skid and spin on the road. The impact was inevitable. I closed my eyes the moment I felt the car hit something. The car spun and came to a stop, and the sound of screeching tires and metal crashing still echoed in my head. When I opened my eyes, everything was dark. The only thing I could hear was my own heavy, irregular breathing. It took me a few seconds to collect myself and realize that the car was stopped sideways on the road. My head was pounding, and the fear began to turn into pure terror as I remembered the figure in the road. I had hit someone. Slowly, I opened the car door and stepped out, the cold night air hitting me immediately. My headlights were still on, illuminating the road ahead, but there was no sign of anybody. The car that had been following me had also vanished. All that remained was the distant sound of wind passing through the trees. I walked around the car, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. On the hood, there was a mark, as if someone had run dirty hands across it, leaving long, thin streaks. But what scared me the most was what I saw when I looked at the windshield. A pale face with empty eyes was imprinted on the glass, as if pressed hard against it. I instinctively stepped back, stumbling over my own feet and falling to the ground. My whole body was trembling, and the air felt heavy and hard to breathe. Not knowing what else to do, I got back into the car and slammed the door. I started the engine, and to my surprise, it roared to life immediately. Without looking back, I accelerated, praying that the road would finally take me back to civilization. As I drove on, I started to see signs that I was approaching a town. The distant lights were a welcome relief, but the terror of that night was still etched in my mind. Finally, I reached a small town and found an open gas station. I stopped the car and got out, still shaking. The attendant looked at me oddly when I walked in, probably because I must have looked as pale as a ghost. I briefly explained what had happened, but he just shook his head, as if he had heard that story before. "You're not the first to talk about this," he said. "Many people say they've seen something strange on that road, especially at night. Some say it's the spirit of someone who died there, seeking revenge, or maybe just company. I never drove that road again, and even today, when I have to drive at night, I feel a shiver down my spine, remembering those hours of terror. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I can still see the reflection of those empty eyes in my rearview mirror." The feeling that something bad was about to happen was palpable, and the darkness that seemed to grow around us made everything even more frightening. The heavy silence and oppressive atmosphere of the cabin created an environment of pure terror. With every step we took toward the source of the sound, we knew we were delving deeper into something we should never have started exploring. We descended the stairs cautiously, each step echoing in the cabin's heavy silence. The air was even colder and more damp, as if the building itself was breathing in a sinister way. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was about to be revealed, something we didn't want to see. When we reached the downstairs area, it seemed even darker than before. The fading afternoon light came weakly through the broken windows, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. We looked around, trying to identify the source of the noise we had heard earlier, but everything seemed exactly as we had left it. Lucas, ever the curious one, began rummaging through the old, deteriorated furniture. He approached an old table against one of the walls. On the table were worn-out candles, all extinguished, some nearly melted completely. The state of the candles suggested they hadn't been used in a long time, but the mere fact that they were there, in an apparently abandoned cabin, was strange. Next to the candles was an old notebook, its cover dusty and worn. Lucas opened it, revealing yellowed, fragile pages. The writing was almost illegible, in a shaky, disorganized handwriting, as if the writer had been hurried or under great stress. Some pages were scribbled with symbols we couldn't identify, strange geometric figures and drawings that seemed like attempts to capture something surreal. "This is bizarre," Lucas murmured, flipping through the pages carefully. Bruno moved closer to look, while Carla kept her distance, clearly uncomfortable. The cabin's atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, and I began to feel a slight headache, perhaps from the stuffy air and the musty smell. While Lucas continued to explore the notebook, Bruno headed to a wooden shelf against the opposite wall. The shelf was cluttered with various objects, all covered in dust. An old oil lantern, a box of matches, some empty glass bottles, and a small wooden box. When Bruno opened the box, he found something even stranger. A set of small, carved wooden figures representing people. They were grotesque, with exaggerated, distorted facial expressions. Carla, watching from afar, noticed something on the walls. When she approached, she saw that the cabin walls were covered in drawings and inscriptions made with what looked like charcoal or ashes. The images were disturbing. Stylized human figures with distorted faces and contorted bodies. Some figures seemed to be in agony, while others were surrounded by what looked like shadows or smoke. Carla ran her hand over one of the figures, feeling the rough texture of the inscriptions as if they were deeply etched. "Who could have done this?" she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. There was something very wrong with that place, and the drawings on the walls only heightened the feeling that we shouldn't be there. Lucas, still flipping through the notebook, suddenly stopped at a specific page. "Hey, check this out," he called. We gathered around and saw a detailed drawing of a female figure, with long, unkempt hair, standing in front of a fireplace. The figure's face was blurred, but the eyes were clearly visible, large and empty, as if they were staring directly at the observer. Below the drawing, there was a phrase written in trembling letters: "She watches us." A shiver ran down my spine. The environment seemed to have grown even colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked around, almost expecting to see something or someone in the shadows. But the cabin was as silent as before, except for the sound of our heavy breathing. Bruno, with a serious expression, said, "This is starting to get really strange. Maybe we should leave." Lucas and I agreed, but before we could make a move, Carla, who had been staring at the covered mirror in the room, decided to find out what was behind the cloth. She pulled the cloth away, revealing an old, dusty mirror. The reflection was distorted by the accumulated grime, but as we watched, something strange happened. For a brief moment, the reflection seemed to show more than just our group. There appeared to be a shadow, an indistinct figure, standing in the background. We blinked, and in the next instant, the shadow was gone, leaving us only with our own confused and frightened reflections. "What was that?" I asked, trying to process what I had seen. No one answered immediately. We were all in shock, eyes fixed on the mirror, waiting for the figure to appear again. But the mirror now only reflected the cabin and our frightened expressions. It was then that we heard the dragging footsteps again, this time clearer and closer. The sound came from somewhere behind us, in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. We turned simultaneously, hearts racing, and saw a shadow move quickly, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Panic took over. We were not alone in that cabin, and whatever was there with us clearly did not want our presence. Without a second thought, we ran towards the exit door, ready to leave that cursed place and all its secrets behind. Our survival instincts kicked in as soon as we realized we weren't alone in the cabin. The sound of dragging footsteps and the sight of that fleeting shadow in the hallway were enough to throw us into a state of absolute panic. Without wasting any time, we raced towards the exit door, our hearts pounding and our thoughts scattered. The cabin, once a place of curiosity, had now turned into a nightmare we wanted to escape as quickly as possible. Bruno was the first to reach the door, but when he pulled on it to open, it wouldn't budge. He tried again, with more force, but the door seemed to be jammed, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. "Damn it, it won't open!" he shouted, his voice laden with frustration and fear. Lucas and I joined him, trying to push and pull the door, but it was useless. It was as if an invisible force was keeping it locked. Carla, now completely terrified, began to cry quietly, looking around frantically as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows and attack us. "We need to find another way out," Lucas suggested, with an urgency in his voice I had never heard before. We looked around desperately for another exit. That's when we noticed a small window on the opposite side of the room, near the ceiling. It was narrow, but it seemed like our only chance for escape. Without hesitation, Bruno ran to the window and began trying to open it. It was old and stuck, but with collective effort, we managed to force it open. The cool forest air rushed in, bringing temporary relief but also increasing the urgency of our escape. The window led to a small patch of vegetation, and although it was a bit high, we decided it was our only option. "I'll go first," said Bruno, preparing to climb. With the help of Lucas and me, he managed to get through the window and jump down. He landed with a muffled thud, but quickly got up and signaled that he was okay. Carla was next, with all of us assisting her, followed by Lucas. When it was my turn, the mixture of relief and fear was almost overwhelming. As I prepared to climb through the window, something strange happened. The sound of footsteps returned, louder and more urgent, as if someone or something was running toward us. I looked back at the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, in the shadows. It was impossible to make out any details, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. "Hurry, get out!" Lucas shouted from outside, snapping me out of my trance. With my heart racing, I climbed through the window and jumped down, landing awkwardly on the ground. Bruno and Lucas helped me up, while Carla, now in tears, looked back at the cabin desperately. "Let's get out of here," Bruno said, his voice firm but tinged with fear. We started running through the vegetation, distancing ourselves as much as possible from the cabin. The forest, which had once seemed welcoming and tranquil, was now a maze of shadows and frightening sounds. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the sound of our footsteps echoed oddly among them. We ran without direction, just trying to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. The sun was nearly setting, and the daylight was quickly fading. Fear drove us, and adrenaline kept us moving. But a part of me felt that we weren't really escaping. There was a persistent feeling that something was following us, something we couldn't see or hear, but that was there, in the shadows. Finally, after what seemed like hours of running, we found a clearing in the forest. We stopped, breathless, trying to catch our breath and orient ourselves. We looked around, hoping to see any sign of civilization, but all we saw was the dense forest surrounding us. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our heavy breathing. "We need to find the trail back," Carla said, trying to stay calm, though her voice still trembled. We looked around, trying to identify anything familiar, but it was difficult with the growing darkness. We pulled out our phones, but the battery was dying and there was no signal. We decided to head in a direction that we hoped would lead us back to the start of the trail, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound of a breaking twig made us turn our heads, expecting to see something emerging from the trees. There was a constant sense of fear. We kept walking, not stopping, trying not to think about the cabin and what we might have seen there. Fear had become our constant companion, and the sensation that we weren't alone in the forest persisted. A presence invisible, following us with every step. We knew we needed to get out of the forest before night fell completely, but darkness was coming fast, and with it, the certainty that our adventure had turned into something far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. The relief of finally leaving the cabin behind was tempered by the realization that something inexplicable had happened there, something we couldn't simply forget or ignore. And as we walked in the growing darkness, the silence of the forest seemed to whisper secrets we never wanted to uncover. As we moved away from the cabin, the forest around us seemed to close in, with the shadows of the trees stretching and darkening rapidly. The daylight had completely faded, and the only light we had came from our phones, whose batteries were almost depleted. The feeling of being watched never left us, as if invisible eyes were following us in the darkness. We tried to calm ourselves, but the fear was palpable. Carla, visibly shaken, held Lucas's hand tightly, while Bruno and I walked ahead, trying to lead the group. The silence of the forest was oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of our hurried footsteps and tense breathing. The forest felt like a labyrinth, with each tree and bush blending into the darkness, making it hard to find a clear direction. The trail we had followed to reach the cabin seemed to have disappeared, and the dense foliage made our passage difficult. The fear of getting completely lost increased with every step. At one point, the sound of breaking branches echoed around us. We all froze, wide-eyed, searching for the source of the noise. We looked in every direction, but there was nothing visible beyond the dark trees. The feeling of being watched intensified. Carla whispered, "Did you hear that?" We all nodded, trying to control our breathing. We decided to keep moving, trying to ignore the strange sounds and unsettling feeling. The night was becoming colder, and the icy air of the forest seemed to penetrate our bones. The darkness was total, and every sound, no matter how insignificant, made our hearts race. The sense of imminent danger was constant. As we walked, something caught our attention. A faint light in the middle of the forest, not too far from where we were. It was a pale light, flickering like a flame. A campfire? Bruno asked hopefully. The idea of finding other people was tempting, so we decided to approach. We walked cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible. The light grew stronger as we got closer, revealing what seemed to be a small clearing. When we got closer, what we saw made our blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a small extinguished campfire, but around it were scattered several candles, some still burning, others already melted. The ground was covered with strange symbols, drawn with something dark that looked like ashes or charcoal. They were the same symbols we had seen in the notebook at the cabin and on the walls, disturbing drawings of twisted human figures. In the midst of the symbols was a wooden figure, similar to the ones Bruno had found on the cabin's shelf. It was grotesque, with a carved expression of pain on its face. Next to the figure was a small leather pouch, partially open. Lucas, with morbid curiosity, picked up the pouch and opened it. Inside were several small carved wooden pieces, all depicting human figures in anguished postures. The atmosphere in the clearing was oppressive. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I had a clear impression that we were not alone. The silence was eerie, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "This is macabre," Bruno said, looking at the figures and symbols on the ground. Carla began to tremble, and Lucas turned pale. We all felt that something was deeply wrong. The clearing, with its candles and symbols, seemed like a ritual site, a place where something dark had happened or might still happen. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the remaining candles and casting a sense of dread over us. The area went completely dark, and the only light came from Lucas's weak phone flashlight, trembling in his hands. In the silence that followed, we heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper coming from all directions. "We have to get out of here," Carla said, her voice barely audible from fear. We all agreed, but our feet felt like they were glued to the ground. It was as if the clearing itself was trapping us, forcing us to stay and face something we didn't understand. Finally, we managed to move slowly, backing out of the clearing. The way back seemed even darker and more intimidating, but the urgency to leave that place pushed us forward. As we moved away, the whispers seemed to grow louder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Panic swelled within us, and the only thing we could do was keep walking, hoping to find an exit before it was too late. The sense of being followed grew stronger as we moved away from the clearing. Every step seemed to be echoed by invisible footsteps. Every sigh we released seemed to blend with almost imperceptible murmurs. The darkness around us was suffocating, and the forest, which once seemed like a place of tranquility and adventure, was now a maze of shadows and fear. Lucas, with the weak light from his phone, led the group, but it was evident that he was as lost as the rest of us. We tried to navigate by intuition, hoping to find some path or clue that would lead us back to safety. Bruno and I walked right behind, while Carla, still trembling with fear, held Lucas's hand tightly, as if that could ward off the feeling of danger. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind us, a clear and distinct sound that made everyone freeze. We turned at the same time, wide-eyed, trying to see something in the darkness. The silence that followed was even more unsettling, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "What was that?" Carla whispered, her voice shaking. No one answered, but the tension was palpable. We tried to keep moving, but with every step, it seemed that the sound of footsteps was getting closer. The sensation of being surrounded, hunted, was inescapable. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees closer, as if they were closing in around us. With every new turn or obstacle, the darkness seemed to increase, swallowing any trace of light and hope. Then we noticed something even more disturbing. The trees around us started to look different, almost deformed. Their shapes, once normal, now appeared twisted, as if they had been warped and bent by some invisible force. The shadows cast by the few lights we had seemed to dance, creating figures that shouldn't be there. The feeling of being trapped in a supernatural snare was intense. Lucas suddenly stopped, the phone flashlight trembling in his hands. Are you seeing this?" he asked, his voice low and filled with fear. We looked where he was pointing, and for a moment, we were all speechless. In the dim light, we could see what looked like faces in the trees. They weren't real faces, but the shadows and contours of the trees created the illusion of anguished faces, silently screaming. Carla let out a whimper of terror, covering her mouth with her hand. This can't be happening," she murmured, tears filling her eyes. Bruno, ever the rational one, tried to calm the group. "Calm down, it must be just our imagination, the darkness and exhaustion," he said, but his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. We continued walking, but the feeling of being watched, pursued, only grew stronger. Occasionally, we heard distant whispers, like voices coming from somewhere deep in the forest. They were unintelligible, but the tone was undeniably threatening. We tried to ignore them, focusing only on finding an exit, but it was impossible not to feel the increasing fear. Then something happened that left us paralyzed with terror. As we walked, Lucas pointed the flashlight ahead, and for a moment, we saw a figure in front of us, standing among the trees. It was a human figure, but strangely indistinct, like a shadow standing upright, with no defined features. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "What is that?" Bruno asked, urgency in his voice. Before anyone could answer, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there. But the impact of its appearance was devastating. It felt as though time had stopped, as if the cold of the night had become even more penetrating. Panic took over all of us. We started running, without direction, just wanting to escape that presence. The forest around us seemed to close in even more, with every branch and bush becoming an obstacle. The darkness was complete, and Lucas's flashlight was almost out of battery. We ran without looking back, pure fear driving us forward. Suddenly, we heard a sound of laughter, low and sibilant, as if someone was enjoying our terror. It was a horrifying sound, coming from all directions at once. We looked around, but there was no one. The sound seemed to be inside our heads, growing in intensity, mixed with the whispers that never ceased. It was at that moment that we felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air became heavy, almost oppressive, and the forest, which had previously seemed alive with whispers and laughter, was now silent. An absolute and crushing silence. We stopped running, panting and confused, trying to understand what was happening. Bruno looked around, his face pale and eyes wide. What's happening?" he asked, but no one had an answer. The silence was complete, as if time itself had stopped. And then, as if a curtain had been lifted, we felt a presence around us, a sensation of something very ancient and powerful, something beyond our understanding. The presence was palpable, like an invisible energy surrounding us. We couldn't see it, but we could feel it. It was an overwhelming force, something we could neither combat nor comprehend. And amidst this terror, one thing became clear. We were no longer in control. Something or someone was guiding us, toying with our fears, and we were merely pieces in a sinister game. Then the forest around us began to change. The trees, once so menacing, started to look more normal, and the path before us seemed clearer. The sense of presence diminished, but the fear persisted. We knew we were still in danger, but a new hope arose when we saw a faint light in the distance, perhaps a way out of the forest. With racing hearts and heavy breaths, we began to walk toward the light, each step laden with apprehension. Whatever had been following us seemed to have receded, but the sense of imminent danger never left us. We were exhausted, but the hope of escaping that nightmare propelled us forward. As we advanced, one thing was certain. Something very strange and supernatural had happened in that forest, something we would never forget. And even if we managed to get out, we knew that the experience would mark us forever, like a shadow that never disappears, always present in the depths of our subconscious. As we moved toward the distant light, the tension in our group was palpable. The forest's silence seemed absolute, as if it were waiting to see what we would do next. Every step we took was cautious, our senses on edge, and the fear that something was still pursuing us was constant. The light ahead grew stronger as we approached, and we soon realized it was a small clearing illuminated by a strange bluish glow. It was a soft, almost ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the ground and the trees around. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, hesitant, but knowing that we couldn't turn back. We entered the clearing, the feeling of being watched diminishing slightly but still present. In the center was a large circle of stones arranged meticulously. In the middle of the circle stood a small stone altar covered with strange symbols and extinguished candles. Everything there seemed to have been set up with a specific purpose, something ancient and ritualistic. Lucas approached the altar, his eyes fixed on the symbols carved into the stone. "Is this some kind of altar?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity and fear. The stones around the altar were also covered with symbols, similar to those we had seen in the cabin in the previous clearing. Bruno crouched beside Lucas, examining the details. "These symbols, they're the same as the ones we saw before," he murmured, running his hand over the cold stones. Carla, still nervous, stayed farther back, looking around as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. I approached the altar, feeling a strange pull toward the place. There was an energy in the air, something almost tangible, as if the very space was charged with an ancient magic. "What is all this?" I asked, more to myself than to the others. The atmosphere was thick with mystery, and the sense that we were at the center of something much larger than ourselves was undeniable. Suddenly, Lucas found something on the altar. It was a small book, old and worn, with a dark leather cover. He opened it carefully, revealing yellowed and fragile pages covered with strange writing and disturbing drawings. There were images of human figures in positions of suffering, surrounded by strange symbols, similar to those we had seen in the cabin earlier. It was terrifying. "This is some kind of journal?" he asked, leafing through the pages carefully. "Or maybe a spell book," suggested Bruno, peering over Lucas's shoulder. The pages were filled with detailed descriptions of rituals, invocations, and enchantments, written in a language we didn't recognize. As Lucas flipped through the book, something fell out from inside. It was an old black and white photograph showing a group of people in front of the same cabin we had found. They all wore old-fashioned clothing and looked serious, almost grim. On the back of the photo, a date was written, 1932. "Look at this," Lucas said, showing us the photo. "They were here, and in that cabin." The revelation was shocking. The people in the photo, possibly members of some cult or secret group, seemed to have some connection to the strange events we were experiencing. As we examined the photograph and the book, the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop drastically. A cold wind swept through the space, causing the candles on the altar to flicker slightly, despite being extinguished. Carla, who was visibly uncomfortable, took a step back. "I don't like this," she said, hugging herself as if she were cold. "We need to get out of here." It was then that we heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the trees around the clearing. It was a low murmur, as if several voices were whispering at once. We looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing visible. The whispering grew louder, becoming clearer. The words were indistinct, but the tone was undeniably threatening. "Do you hear that?" Bruno asked, his voice tense. We all nodded, the fear rising again. The sound seemed to come from all directions, surrounding us, intensifying the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, the candles on the altar lit up by themselves, with bluish, flickering flames. The supernatural phenomenon made us take a step back, our eyes wide with shock. The flames danced irregularly, casting strange shadows on the stones around. "This is impossible," murmured Lucas, his voice laden with disbelief. The candles continued to burn, and the sound of the whispers grew louder, now seeming to form words we couldn't understand. The energy in the clearing was intense, almost suffocating, as if we were in the midst of some supernatural event. Bruno suddenly let out a cry of pain and dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "What's happening?" he shouted, his eyes tightly shut. Carla rushed to him, trying to help, but it seemed there was nothing she could do. Bruno was clearly in agony, but we couldn't understand what was causing it. Then, as if a wave of energy passed through us, we all felt an intense pressure on our minds, as if something or someone was trying to invade our thoughts. It was a terrible sensation, a mix of pain and terror, as if we were being torn apart from within. Lucas fell beside Bruno, also holding his head, while Carla and I struggled to stay on our feet. The candles on the altar burned even more brightly, and the sound of the whispers was now inside our heads, filling our minds with a cacophony of voices. Desperate, we tried to leave the clearing, but it was as if our bodies were stuck in place. The mental pressure continued to build, and fear turned into absolute terror. We felt that something was trying to communicate, something ancient and powerful, but the words were incomprehensible, just a sense of dread and desperation. Then, as abruptly as it began, the pressure disappeared. The candles went out, and the whispers ceased. We stood there, trying to understand what had just happened. Bruno and Lucas were on the ground, exhausted and pale, while Carla and I supported each other, trying to catch our breath. The silence in the clearing was deafening. The sense of supernatural presence had diminished, but the fear was still there. It was as if we had just survived an encounter with something beyond our comprehension, something that left an indelible mark on our minds. With great effort, we helped Bruno and Lucas to their feet. We were all shaken, but we knew we needed to leave that place. With the old photograph and the book in hand, we began to move away from the clearing, the bluish light fading behind us. We walked in silence, our hearts still racing, and the forest around us seemed darker than ever. The experience would leave us marked, and the sense of danger was still present. We knew that we were no longer in the same world as before, that something had changed forever. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we spotted a dirt road. The sight of something so mundane brought an immediate sense of relief, as if we were finally returning to reality. Without looking back, we followed the road, hoping it would lead us somewhere safe. As we distanced ourselves from the forest, one thing became clear. Whatever we had encountered in that cabin and in the clearing was real, and its presence still haunts us. The events of that night were not something we could simply forget or ignore. The fear and uncertainty would follow us for a long time, and the certainty that we would never be completely safe, that something would always follow us, even if only in the shadows of our memories, was undeniable. One thing was certain: I would never venture into the forest again.